Have you ever stood at the edge of something terrible, knowing that what happens in the next few hours will change everything, not just for you, but for generations unborn? That's where Godric stood on the 14th day of October in the year of our Lord, 1066, gripping a spear he barely knew how to use, watching an army of Normans assemble in the valley below like a living nightmare made of steel and horsehair. But here's the thing most people don't know about that day. The day that would become known as the Battle of Hastings, the day England fell and rose again as something entirely different. The real story isn't just about kings and conquest. It's about a young shield-bearer named Godric who would witness the most devastating military deception in medieval history and whose choice in a single moment would haunt him for the rest of his life. Let me take you there. Let me show you what really happened when clever men made other men die for crowns they would never wear. The smell hit Godric first. 7,000 men packed together on a hillside, fear sweat mixing with morning dew, leather, horse dung, and the metallic tang of freshly sharpened steel. He was 17 years old, gangly as a newborn colt, with hair the color of wheat before harvest and hands that wouldn't stop shaking no matter how tightly he gripped his ashwood spear. "Stop fidgeting, boy." The voice belonged to Wulfric, who stood beside him in the shield wall. Wulfric was everything Godric wasn't, broad as an oak door, arms thick with muscle earned from 20 years of farming and fighting, a beard going gray at the edges. He'd fought for King Harold at Stamford Bridge just 3 weeks ago, where they'd crushed the Viking army so thoroughly that the survivors needed only 24 ships to carry home what had arrived in 300. "I can't help it," Wulfric whispered. The whispering felt absurd when they were surrounded by thousands of men shouting orders, clanging weapons, calling out to their gods. "My hands, they won't—" "They'll steady when it starts," Wulfric said, not unkindly. "They always do. The waiting's the worst part. The fear before the fear, I call it." Godric had been conscripted from his village 3 days ago. His father was too old, his brother too young, and so the reeve had pointed at him and said simply, "You." And now here he stood, in a shield wall atop Senlac Hill, watching Duke William's army arrange itself with the precision of a master craftsman laying tiles. "Have you ever seen anything like that?" Godric breathed. Below them, the Norman force was a marvel of military organization. In the center, infantry, men with spears and swords not so different from the English. But on the flanks, something the English had precious little of: cavalry. Hundreds of mounted knights, their destriers pawing the ground, their armor catching the weak October sun like scattered coins. And behind them, ranks of archers, their bows already strung. "Aye, I've seen it," Wulfric said grimly. "Seen it and bled from it. Cavalry's a terrible thing when used right, but we've got the high ground and we've got the wall." He slapped his shield, solid lime wood, nearly as tall as Godric, painted with faded red crosses. "Nothing breaks a good shield wall if the men hold. Remember that, nothing." The English position was strong, even Godric could see that. King Harold had chosen well. Senlac Hill rose like a natural fortress, and the English, or what Harold's scouts had managed to gather after their forced march from the north, held the high ground. Huscarls, the king's household warriors, formed the core of the line. These were professional soldiers, men who trained with sword and axe since boyhood. Their armor was good, their shields excellent, their experience invaluable. Around them, filling out the line, were the fyrd, the militia, men like Wulfric and Godric, farmers and craftsmen called to war by ancient obligation. Some had leather jerkins, some had mail if they were lucky or had stripped it from the dead at Stamford Bridge. All carried shields and whatever weapons they could muster. "Shield wall!" The cry went up, passed from man to man like a prayer. "Form the wall!" Godric pressed his shield against Wulfric's. On his other side, a man with a badly scarred face did the same. The pressure was immense, 7,000 men contracting into a single organism, a wall of wood and iron and flesh that stretched across the ridgeline. "Lock shields! Lock them tight!" The shield rim dug into Godric's shoulder. He could feel Wulfric's breath against his cheek, could smell the onions the old man had eaten for breakfast. There was an intimacy to the shield wall that felt almost obscene. You were pressed so close to strangers that you knew their every tremor, their every exhalation. "What do we do when they charge?" Godric asked, his voice cracking like a boy's, though he'd been called a man just 3 days ago. "They'll stand," Wulfric said simply. "We plant our feet and we stand. Their horses will break before we do. Animals won't charge a solid line, it's against their nature. And if the infantry comes, we stab through the gaps. You thrust, you pull back, you thrust again. Simple as gutting a pig." "I've never gutted a pig." Wulfric actually laughed at that. "Gods help us all." From somewhere down the line, a clear voice rose above the din. "Ut! Ut!" The battle cry of the English, older than Christianity, older perhaps than memory. Ut, meaning out, a challenge and a warning. Get out, go away, this land is ours. 7,000 throats took up the cry. Ut! 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 The sound was enormous, a physical thing that seemed to shake the very earth. Godric found himself shouting it too, felt something primal loosen in his chest. The fear didn't leave. Fear never leaves, Wulfric will tell him later, but it transformed into something he could use. Across the valley, the Normans had their own cry, "Dex I! God aid us!" They roared it again and again, and the sound carried up the hill with the morning wind. Between the two armies, perhaps 200 yards of trampled grass and muddy earth, no man's land, a place where, very soon, the soil would drink deeply. "Here they come," Wulfric muttered. The Norman infantry began to advance. Have you ever watched a storm approach across an open field? That's what it looked like. Thousands of men moving in loose formation, their spears pointing to heaven, their shields catching light like scattered coins. They weren't charging, not yet. This was a probing advance, testing the English line, searching for weakness. "Hold!" the commander shouted. "Hold the line! Let them come to us!" The Normans trudged up the hill. The slope wasn't steep, but it was enough to tire legs, enough to make shields feel heavier, enough to steal the wind from lungs. At 50 yards, the Norman archers loosed. The sky darkened. Godric looked up and saw death falling, hundreds of arrows arcing high, tumbling as they descended. He barely had time to crouch behind his shield before the storm hit. The sound was like hail on a thatched roof, multiplied 1,000 times. Arrows punched into shields, glanced off helmets, found the gaps in armor and in luck. Men screamed. Godric heard someone behind him gasping, choking. An arrow had punched through the gap between two shields and caught the man in the throat.
"Hold!" Wulfric roared. "Hold the wall! Don't break!" Another flight of arrows. Another. The Normans were shooting high, trying to drop their missiles onto the English from above, but the shield wall held. Most arrows thudded harmlessly into limewood. Some found flesh, but not enough to matter. Not yet. And then the infantry hit. The impact shook Godric's entire body. One moment he was standing in relative calm, and the next there was a Norman soldier directly in front of him, screaming, stabbing with a spear. Godric thrust blindly through the gap between shields, felt his spear point catch on something. Mail? Leather? Flesh? And then Wulfric's axe was sweeping past his face, catching the Norman in the collarbone. The man went down. Another took his place immediately. This was war. Not the glorious thing the bards sang about, but a grinding, suffocating press of bodies. a place where you couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction, where the air was thick with screams and prayer and the wet sounds of metal finding meat. Godric thrust and pulled back and thrust again, mechanical as a loom worker, his mind gone to some distant place where 17-year-old boys don't have to watch men die. The Normans pressed hard. They were good soldiers, well-trained, but they were fighting uphill against a solid wall. For every English shield they broke, 3 Norman warriors fell. The English had reach, height, and the terrible leverage of gravity on their side. "They're breaking!" someone shouted. "The bastards are breaking!" And they were. The Norman infantry was pulling back, shields raised, retreating down the slope in loose order. "Hold!" the English commanders screamed it. "Hold the line! Do not pursue!" But Godric could feel it, a tremor running through the wall, like a rope beginning to fray. Men wanted to chase. It was natural, wasn't it? The enemy was running. You chased running things. That's what victory looked like. "Stay in formation." Wulfric grabbed a young huscarl who'd taken a step forward. "Don't break the wall." The Norman infantry retreated fully, streaming back down the hill. They'd left perhaps 100 dead on the slope. The English had lost maybe 30. Godric let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. His hands were still shaking, but different now. Not fear, but something wilder. Excitement? Relief? He'd survived his first combat. He was still alive. "Good work, boy," Wulfric said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You held." But the old warrior's eyes weren't on Godric. They were on the valley below, where the Norman cavalry was forming up. "Now comes the real test," Wulfric muttered. "Now we see if that bastard William is as clever as they say." Let me tell you something about Duke William of Normandy, the man the English called William the Bastard, and not just because his mother was a tanner's daughter. William was 38 years old that October morning, and he'd spent 32 of those years fighting his own nobles, fighting the French king, fighting every damn person who questioned his right to exist, let alone to rule. William was not a large man, but he carried himself like a cathedral, immovable, certain, built to last. His face was hard as chiseled granite, his eyes the color of winter sky. He'd survived assassination attempts, rebellions, betrayals. He'd held Normandy together through sheer will and calculated brutality. And now he wanted England. He sat on his destrier, a massive warhorse bred for carrying armored men, surveying the ridge where Harold's army had bloodied his infantry. His commanders clustered around him, Odo, his half-brother and Bishop of Bayeux, wearing mail beneath his clerical robes, William Fitz-Osbern, his closest friend, Robert of Mortain, and Alan Rufus of Brittany. "The ridge is strong," Fitz-Osbern said. "We can't break that shield wall with infantry alone." "No," William agreed. His voice was surprisingly soft for a man of his reputation. "No, we can't." "The cavalry, then?" Odo suggested. "A full charge?" William shook his head slowly. "Horses won't charge a solid wall, and even if we could force them to, we'd lose half our knights breaking through. No, we need them to leave the ridge." "They won't," Robert of Mortain said flatly. "Harold's not a fool. He knows his advantage." "Harold's not a fool," William agreed, "but his men are proud and frightened and young." He turned to Alan Rufus. "Your Bretons, can they perform a retreat, a convincing one?" Silence fell over the command group. They all understood what William was suggesting. "A feigned retreat," Fitz-Osbern said slowly. "Lure them off the ridge?" "Precisely." William's eyes never left the English line. "We attack in waves. Infantry first, then Breton cavalry on the left flank. The Bretons engage, then break. Not too quickly. It must look real. If we do it right, if they believe they're winning." "The Fyrd will chase," Odo finished. "The professionals might hold, but the militia, they'll smell blood and forget discipline." "And when they're strung out on the slope, away from the wall," Robert smiled grimly, "we cut them to pieces. We reform, turn, charge. We hit them in the open field where our cavalry has the advantage." He looked at each commander in turn.
This will be hard to execute. The Bretons must sell it. They must look defeated. And Alan, make sure your knights understand. This isn't cowardice. This is war. The second Norman assault began an hour later. This time, the infantry advance was supported by cavalry on both flanks. Godric watched them come with a sick feeling in his stomach. He'd never seen horses used in battle before. They seemed impossibly large, impossibly fast. The knights sat high in their saddles, lances couched, shields blazoned with dozens of different heraldic devices. "Remember," Wulfric shouted over the rising din, "horses won't charge the wall. They'll shy away at the last moment. Plant your spear and hold." But Godric could see men beginning to falter. The sight of those war horses, the thunder of their hooves, the sunlight flashing off lance points, it was overwhelming. It made you want to run as your mind screamed to hold still. "Oot!" the English roared. "Oot! Oot!" The Norman infantry hit first again, and again the shield wall held. But this time, the cavalry swept in from the flanks. The Bretons on the left, Norman and French knights on the right. At the last possible second, just as Wulfric had predicted, the horses shied. They wouldn't charge straight into a wall of spears. Instead, the knights wheeled, riding parallel to the English line, stabbing down with lances, trying to find gaps.
But the left flank, where the Bretons attacked, something happened. Godric couldn't see it clearly from his position in the center, but he could hear it. A sudden surge of English voices, surprised, excited. "They're running! The cavalry's breaking! They're fleeing!" And then, to Godric's horror, he felt the shield wall move, not just a step or two, but a genuine forward surge. Men were breaking formation, charging down the slope after the Breton cavalry. "No!" the commanders were screaming. "Hold the line! Hold the line!" But it was too late. A section of the English left flank, perhaps 500 men, maybe more, had abandoned the ridge and were streaming downhill after the retreating Bretons. They looked like ants from Godric's position, small figures spreading out across the slope, some running faster than others, the formation dissolving into chaos. "Oh no," Wulfric breathed. "Oh no, you stupid bastards." And then Godric saw it. The Breton cavalry weren't fleeing anymore. They'd stopped. They were turning, reforming with a speed and precision that spoke of careful training and perfect understanding. And they were joined now by other Norman cavalry units, wheeling around from the flanks. The trap was sprung. Now, let me tell you what happened next, because this is the moment that would haunt Godric for the rest of his life. The English who'd broken formation, farmers mostly, men from the Fyrd who'd never fought in a real battle before, suddenly found themselves alone on the hillside. The shield wall was behind them, the Norman cavalry was in front, and there was nowhere to run. The slaughter was methodical. Knights swept through the scattered English like farmers reaping wheat. Lances punched through leather and mail. Swords rose and fell. Men who'd been laughing just moments ago, certain they were chasing a beaten enemy, now screamed for help that wouldn't come. Godric watched it all from the ridge. He could see individual Englishmen trying to run back uphill, their legs churning, arms pumping. Some almost made it. One man got within 30 yards of the shield wall before a Norman knight rode him down from behind, the horse's hooves crushing him into the mud. "Gods have mercy," someone muttered beside Godric. But there was no mercy, not today. The Bretons and Normans circled the isolated English, driving them together, compressing them into a tight cluster. Some men tried to form a makeshift shield wall right there on the slope, but without proper support, without the ridgeline behind them, they were cut apart in minutes. Wulfric's hand gripped Godric's shoulder so tightly it hurt. "Watch this," the old warrior said, and there was something terrible in his voice. "Watch what pride costs. Remember it." Godric wanted to look away but couldn't. He watched until the last of the isolated English fell. 500 men, gone in perhaps 20 minutes. 500 fathers and sons and brothers, dead because they believed what they wanted to believe, that the enemy was beaten.
The Norman cavalry pulled back, reforming at the base of the hill. They'd barely lost anyone. The tactic had worked perfectly. And up on the ridge, the English shield wall, now missing a large chunk of its left flank, stood in stunned silence. King Harold himself came to inspect the damage. Godric had never been this close to the king before. Harold Godwinson was 44 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered by years of campaigning. He'd been king for barely 6 months, elected by the Witan after Edward the Confessor died without an heir. A good king, people said, a strong king, the kind of man who'd force-marched his army 250 miles in 5 days to surprise the Vikings at Stamford Bridge. But now his face was gray. "How many?" he asked quietly. 500, maybe more. The whole left section of the fyrd, just gone. Harold was silent for a long moment, staring down at the valley where the Norman cavalry was regrouping. It was a feint. The retreat was staged. William drew them out deliberately. "The bastard," someone spat. But Harold shook his head. "No, it was brilliant, and if we don't learn from it, we'll all die here." He raised his voice so more men could hear. "Listen to me, all of you. The Normans will try that trick again. They'll pretend to run. They'll make it look real. And when they do, you must hold. Do you understand? I don't care if it looks like they're running all the way back to Normandy. You hold this ridge. This is our strength. The moment we leave this hill, we're dead." "Ut!" the men roared, but there was a brittleness to it now. They'd seen what happens when the wall breaks. Harold made his way down the line, speaking to huscarls and fyrd-men alike, his presence steadying the troops. When he reached Godric's section, he paused. "You held," he said, looking directly at Godric. Godric felt his throat close. He managed to nod. "Keep holding," Harold said. "That's all I ask. Just hold until nightfall, and William will have to withdraw. He can't sustain this. His men are far from home. Ours are standing on English soil." The king smiled then, and it transformed his face. "We're going to win this, but only if we're smarter than we were an hour ago." As Harold moved on, Wulfric leaned close to Godric. "The king's lying." "What?" "About winning. He knows it's not that simple. William won't give up just because the sun sets. This is for England itself. William staked everything on this battle." Wulfric's eyes followed the king's retreating figure. "But Harold's doing what a good leader does, giving men hope, making them believe." "Don't you believe?" Godric asked. Wulfric was quiet for a moment. "I believe we'll stand here until we can stand any more. Beyond that," he shrugged, "the gods will decide." The afternoon stretched on like a fever dream. The Normans attacked again and again and again, wave after wave of infantry and cavalry, each assault slightly different, each one probing for new weaknesses. And twice more the Breton cavalry performed their feigned retreat, and twice more some English soldiers broke formation to pursue. Not as many as the first time. Harold had spread the word and his commanders were watching for it. But still, men died. 50 here, 100 there, lured away from safety and cut down in the open. Godric lost track of time. The battle became a blur of motion and noise. Thrust, withdraw, thrust again. His spear broke at some point, and Wulfric handed him a dead man's sword. His shield splintered, and someone pressed a new one into his hands. His arms were made of lead. His legs trembled with exhaustion, but he stood. They all stood. "Water!" someone croaked.
Before we continue, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing.
Water skins were passed forward from the rear. Godric drank greedily, the liquid tasting of leather and ash. How long had they been fighting? 3 hours? 4? The sun had moved across the sky, but not far enough. It felt like they'd been standing here forever. The Norman cavalry tried a different approach, feigning attacks from one side while the real assault came from another. It almost worked. A section of the English right flank started to pivot, and for a terrible moment, Godric thought the line might collapse entirely. But Harold's huscarls held the center, and the flanks recovered. "They're getting tired too," Wulfric observed during a brief lull. "Look at their cavalry. The horses are blown, and their infantry, they're dragging their feet now." It was true. The Norman attacks were losing intensity. Men on both sides were reaching the limits of human endurance. This couldn't last much longer. But then, something changed. It started with a cry from the English rear. "The king! Someone get a healer! The king is hit!" A ripple of shock ran through the entire army. Godric turned his head, not leaving formation but craning to see, and glimpsed King Harold surrounded by his bodyguards, one hand pressed to his face. There was blood, a lot of blood. "What happened?" Godric asked desperately. An older huscarl, his face grim, called back, "Arrow, high trajectory, caught him in the eye." The world seemed to tilt. Their king, their leader, hit. But Harold was still standing, still conscious. Godric could see him waving away the healers, pointing at the shield wall, clearly ordering his men to hold position. The king's brothers, Gurth and Leowine, moved closer to him, their faces tight with worry. "He'll live," Wulfric said, though he didn't sound certain. "He has to." The Norman army saw the commotion. They must have seen it, because their next attack came with renewed fury. Perhaps they'd seen Harold fall. Perhaps their scouts had reported the king wounded. Whatever the reason, this assault was different, desperate, all or nothing. Infantry and cavalry together, a combined strike at the English center where Harold and his household warriors stood. The Normans weren't being clever anymore. They were trying to bludgeon their way through by sheer force, and the English line began to buckle. Godric felt it first as pressure, the shields to his left compressing, men being pushed back despite themselves. Then he heard the sounds of fighting intensify, the clash of metal becoming a continuous roar. The center was under enormous stress. "They're going for the king!" Wulfric shouted. "They're trying to kill Harold!" And suddenly Godric understood. If Harold fell, truly fell, not just wounded but dead, the English army would break. Everything depended on him. The king was the center that held everything together. "Fall back!" someone screamed. "The center's collapsing!" "No!" That was Harold's voice, raw with pain but still commanding. "Hold! We hold!" But the English center wasn't just holding anymore. It was being pushed. Step by step, the huscarls were giving ground under the weight of the Norman assault. Knights had actually broken into the shield wall in places, their horses trampling over the fallen, their swords rising and falling in terrible rhythm. Godric saw a Norman knight riding directly towards King Harold. The knight's lance was leveled, his destrier foaming at the mouth. Harold's brothers saw it too. They moved to intercept, shields raised. The lance took Gurth full in the chest, punching through mail like it was cloth. Harold's brother fell. A second knight rode over him, heading for Harold himself. And Leowine, Harold's other brother, threw himself in front of the king. The sword that should have taken Harold's head caught Leowine in the shoulder instead. He went down. Both of the king's brothers, fallen within seconds of each other. "No!" The cry came from 100 English throats. But Harold still stood. Wounded, bleeding from his face, both brothers dead or dying at his feet, still he stood. He raised his axe, the great Danish war axe that had been his father's, and brought it down on the knight's horse. The animal screamed and collapsed, throwing its rider. Harold's huscarls swarmed over the fallen knight like wolves. "The king stands!" Wulfric roared. "Harold stands! Hold the line!" And they did. Somehow, incredibly, the English center steadied. Men who'd been on the verge of breaking found new strength. The shield wall reformed. The Norman assault, so close to breakthrough, stalled, and then began to pull back. The sun was much lower now, perhaps 2 hours until darkness. Both armies were exhausted, bloodied, depleted. The slope between them was carpeted with the dead, Norman and English, mixed together in death's democracy. Godric sagged against his shield. His entire body shook. He'd seen things today that no 17-year-old should see. He'd killed men. He thought he had, anyway. The details were hazy, survival overriding memory. But the faces stayed with him. The Norman soldier who'd locked eyes with Godric just before Wulfric's axe split his skull. The young knight, barely older than Godric himself, who'd fallen screaming from his wounded horse. "We're going to make it," someone said. "Just hold until dark. We're going to make it." But Godric looked at Wulfric and saw something in the old warrior's face that scared him. "What?" Godric asked. "What is it?" "Look at their cavalry," Wulfric said quietly. "What do you see?" Godric looked. The Norman cavalry were regrouping again, but differently this time. They were forming into a single massive unit, hundreds of cavalry in one overwhelming formation. They're gathering everything for one more attack." "Not just any attack." Wulfric's voice was barely a whisper. "Look at the infantry. They're pulling back. All the infantry is pulling back." And they were. The Norman foot soldiers were retreating beyond the cavalry, opening a clear path from the valley floor to the English ridge. "They're going to charge," Godric said. "All the cavalry at once, straight at us." "No," Wulfric said. "They're going to charge at him." He pointed at King Harold, still visible at the center of the English line, his face wrapped in bloody cloth, his axe in his hands. "William's going to throw everything he has at killing Harold, because if Harold falls, we lose," Godric finished. They watched as the Norman cavalry began their approach, not fast at first, a walk, then a trot, preserving the horses' strength for the final push. They came in a wedge formation, the point aimed directly at the English center. "This is it," Wulfric said. He turned to Godric, and there was something like tenderness in his scarred face. "You've done well today, boy. Better than most men twice your age. Your father would be proud." "Why are you talking like—" "Because we're about to die," Wulfric said simply. "Most of us anyway, but maybe not all. Maybe some will live. Maybe you will." He gripped Godric's shoulder. "If you do, if you survive this, I want you to remember something. This battle, this day, the trick William used, the feinted retreat. Remember how it worked. Remember what pride and anger cost. Because someone needs to. Someone needs to tell the story true. Wulfric, promise me." The Norman cavalry was cantering now. The ground shook. "I promise," Godric said. "Good lad." Wulfric turned to face the oncoming charge. "Now let's sell our lives dear." Here's what you need to understand about cavalry charges. They're not actually about the horses. Oh, the horses matter, their weight, their speed, their terror-inducing presence. But the real weapon is psychological. It's the thunder of hooves that makes your bladder weak. It's the sight of tons of horseflesh and armored knights bearing down on you that makes your legs want to run, even as your mind screams to stand still. It's the knowledge that in about 30 seconds, you'll either be dead or wishing you were. The Norman wedge hit the English center like God's own hammer. Despite everything, despite the shield wall, despite the high ground, despite the spears and the courage and the defiance, the sheer momentum of hundreds of war horses crashed into the English line and broke it. Not everywhere, not all at once, but at the very center, where Harold stood, where the Huscarls had been fighting all day, where exhaustion and casualties had weakened the wall, there it broke. Godric saw a warhorse rear up directly in front of him, its hooves like sledgehammers. He thrust his sword blindly at its belly and felt it skitter off the animal's padded barding. Then the horse's shoulder hit his shield and he was flying backward, landing hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. Chaos, pure chaos. The shield wall was gone, replaced by a swirling melee where no one could tell friend from enemy. Godric scrambled to his feet just in time to avoid being trampled by another horse. A Norman knight leaned down, sword sweeping toward Godric's neck. Wulfric's axe took the knight in the side, folding him like a letter. "Stay close," the old warrior roared, but the noise was so overwhelming that Godric barely heard him. And through it all, through the screaming and the dying, Godric caught glimpses of King Harold. The king was still fighting. Wounded, half-blind, surrounded by enemies, Harold Godwinson fought like a man possessed. His axe, that great Danish war axe, split shields and helms alike. His remaining huscarls formed a tight circle around him, their shields overlapping, their spears and swords lashing out at any Norman who came close. But there were too many, far too many. The Norman cavalry pressed from all sides, and more Norman infantry was running up the slope now, reinforcing the breakthrough. "The king!" someone screamed. "Protect the king!" Godric tried to move toward Harold, to do something, anything, but the press of bodies was too thick. He and Wulfric were being pushed away from the center, toward the right flank, where what remained of the English line was still holding. And then Godric saw it happen. A group of Norman knights, 4 of them working together, crashed into Harold's defensive circle. The huscarls tried to stop them. They killed one knight, wounded another, but the remaining 2 broke through. One knight's sword took Harold in the leg. The king stumbled. For just a moment, his guard dropped. The second knight's sword came down. Time does strange things in moments like that. It slows, it crystallizes. Every detail becomes sharp as broken glass. Godric saw the blade fall, saw it catch King Harold across the shoulder and chest, saw Harold try to raise his axe one more time, saw it slip from his fingers, saw the greatest warrior king England had known in a generation fall to his knees in the mud of Senlac Hill. And then the Norman knights were on him, their swords rising and falling, until Godric couldn't see Harold anymore through the press of armored bodies. "No!" the wail came from the entire English army. "The king! The king is down!" And just like that, it was over. Not the fighting. The fighting would continue for perhaps another hour, scattered groups of huscarls and ferdmen being hunted down across the darkening hillside. But the battle was over. The moment Harold fell, the heart went out of the English army. Men began to run, first in 1s and 2s, then in waves. The shield wall, that magnificent, terrible formation that had held all day against everything William could throw at it, simply dissolved. Warriors who'd fought with superhuman courage for 10 hours suddenly became refugees, streaming away toward the forest, toward the roads, toward anywhere that wasn't here. "Godric!" Wulfric grabbed him. "We have to go, now!" "But the king!" "The king is dead. He's dead, and if we stay here, we die too. Move!" They ran. Godric had never felt shame like this. After everything they'd endured, to run, it felt like betrayal. But Wulfric was right. To stay was to die for nothing. Harold was gone. The battle was lost. England was lost. They ran downhill toward the woods, joining a stream of other survivors. Behind them, Godric could hear the Norman cavalry pursuing, hear the screams of men being ridden down. He didn't look back, couldn't look back. His legs pumped mechanically, his lungs burned. Beside him, Wulfric was breathing hard, his face gray. They'd almost reached the tree line when Godric heard horsebacks directly behind them. "Down!" Wulfric shoved Godric aside, just as a Norman lance would have skewered them both. The knight thundered past, already swinging his horse around for another pass. Wulfric didn't wait. He charged the horse, actually charged it, his axe held high. The horse reared, and Wulfric's axe pawed its front leg. The animal screamed and fell, throwing its rider. The Norman knight crashed to the ground hard. Before he could rise, Wulfric was on him, axe rising and falling with brutal efficiency. "Go!" shouted Godric. "Get to the trees!" But Godric saw what Wulfric didn't, another Norman knight coming fast from the left. "Behind you!" Wulfric turned, tried to bring his axe up. Too slow. The knight's sword took him high in the chest, punching through mail, through leather, through flesh. Wulfric's axe fell from his hands. "No!" Godric was moving before he thought about it, his sword coming up, catching the knight's follow-up strike. The impact jarred Godric's arms, nearly knocked the weapon from his hands. He struck back wildly, desperately. The blade skittered off the knight's mail, but caught him in the exposed throat just above his gorget. The Norman made a terrible gurgling sound and fell from his saddle. Godric dropped to his knees beside Wulfric. The old warrior was on his back, one hand pressed to his chest where blood pulsed between his fingers. So much blood. "Wulfric!" Good lad," Wulfric gasped. His eyes were already going distant. You'll tell them about today. I promised, remember?"
Good. Wulfric tried to smile and managed something close. England will rise again. Might take 100 years, but... His eyes focused on something past Godric's shoulder, something Godric couldn't see. "Oh, there's my father. Hello, father. I'm coming." And he was gone. Godric reached the forest alone. He found a hollow beneath a fallen oak and crawled into it like a wounded animal. Around him, he could hear other survivors moving through the darkness, some calling for comrades, some weeping, all lost. England had fallen. King Harold was dead, his brothers dead, his greatest warriors dead. Duke William the Bastard had won. And tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that, William would march to London and take the crown that Harold had worn for 9 months. Godric pressed his forehead against the cold earth and wept. He wept for Harold, who'd been a good king and hadn't deserved to die like that. He wept for Wulfric, who'd been kind to a scared boy and had died saving that boy's life. He wept for the 500 men who'd chased the feigned retreat and never came back. He wept for England itself, for the old world that had ended today on a blood-soaked hillside in Sussex. But even as he wept, even as the grief threatened to swallow him whole, he remembered his promise. Someone needs to tell the story true. 3 weeks later, Godric stood in his village for the first time since being conscripted. The place looked exactly the same thatched cottages, the same muddy paths, the same mill wheel turning in the stream. But everything was different. Everyone knew. News of the battle had spread like wildfire. King Harold dead, the English army destroyed, the Normans coming. Godric's father embraced him at the door of their cottage, held him so tightly that Godric thought his ribs might crack. His mother wept. His younger brother stared at him with wide eyes, taking in the new scars, the way Godric flinched at sudden movements, the darkness that hadn't been there before. "You survived," his father kept saying. "Thank God you survived." But Godric didn't feel like a survivor. He felt like a ghost. That night, the village elders gathered in the hall. They wanted to hear about the battle firsthand. Godric didn't want to tell them, didn't want to relive it, but he remembered his promise to Wulfric. So he told them everything. He told them about the shield wall, about the Norman cavalry, about the feigned retreats, how they'd looked so real, how men died chasing an enemy that was only pretending to run. He told them about the bravery of the Huscarls, about Harold's brothers dying to protect their king, about Harold himself, fighting half-blind, refusing to surrender, refusing to run. And he told them about the end, about the moment the king fell, about how the heart went out of the English army all at once. When he finished, the hall was silent. Finally, the village priest spoke. "So we're to have a foreign king now? A Norman king?" "Yes," Godric said quietly. "And what kind of king will he be?" Godric thought about Duke William, the man whose tactical brilliance had defeated England's best warriors, the man who'd used deception as a weapon, who turned English pride against itself. "A hard king," Godric said finally.
But maybe a wise one too. He beat us by being smarter, not just stronger. A king who can think like that. He trailed off. It felt like treason to speak well of the man who'd killed Harold, but it was true. William had won because he understood war in a way Harold hadn't, had understood that sometimes retreat is advance, that sometimes losing is winning. "Will you fight him if he comes here?" his father asked. Godric looked at his hands. They still shook sometimes, especially at night. "No," he said. "The fighting's done. We lost. And I swallowed hard. I've seen enough death." 5 years later, England was a different country. William had been crowned king on Christmas Day 1066 in Westminster Abbey. The English nobles who'd submitted to him kept their lands, for a while. Those who'd resisted had been crushed. Norman barons now held most of the great estates. Norman clergymen ran most of the churches. The English language was becoming secondary to French in the halls of power. But England endured. Changed, yes. Conquered, yes, but not destroyed. Godric had married by then. He had a daughter, named her Eadgifu after his mother. He farmed his father's land and tried not to think about the battle too much. But sometimes, on October 14th, he would walk to the hill above his village and stand looking south, remembering. He kept his promise to Wulfric. Whenever anyone asked about Hastings, Godric told the story true. Not a glorious tale of heroes and honor, but the real story of tired men standing on a hill, of a clever enemy who used deception as a weapon, of pride and anger leading good men to their deaths. "Why do you always emphasize the false retreat? Why is that the part you focus on?" his wife asked him once. "Because it's the part people need to remember," Godric said. "The bravery, the courage, the fighting, people remember that naturally. But the lesson, the tactical lesson?" He shook his head. "That takes work. Someone has to teach each new generation. Sometimes your enemy will show you what you want to see. They'll pretend to be weak when they're strong, pretend to run when they're setting a trap. And if you're not careful, if you let pride or anger or bloodlust make you stupid, they'll use your own strength against you." It was a lesson England had learned the hard way. But Godric was determined it wouldn't be forgotten. 20 years after Hastings, Godric was no longer young. His hair was graying, his back perpetually sore from farming. His daughter had married a Norman knight's son, a fact that would have seemed impossible in 1066, but was increasingly common now. England and Normandy were mixing, creating something new. One autumn day, a group of Norman soldiers came through the village. They were escorting a bishop, a Norman nobleman who'd fought at Hastings. The bishop stopped to water his horses and noticed Godric watching from his doorway. "You have the look of a soldier," the French-accented English said. "Once, long ago," Godric replied. "Where did you serve?" Godric hesitated, then said, "Senlac Hill, with King Harold." The bishop's eyebrows raised. "You were there? At the great battle?" "I was." The Norman bishop was quiet for a moment, studying Godric with new interest. Then, "May I ask you something? I've heard stories about that day, from both sides, but there's one thing I've never understood. Why did so many English leave their shield wall? Our own chronicles say your position was nearly impenetrable, yet hundreds of your men charged downhill after our cavalry. Why?" This was it, the question Godric had spent 20 years thinking about, the lesson he'd promised to preserve. "Because we saw what we wanted to see," Godric said. "Your cavalry looked defeated. They looked like they were running in fear, and we wanted to believe it. After fighting all morning—"
"Good." Wulfric tried to smile and managed something close. England will rise again. Might take 100 years, but..." His eyes focused on something past Godric's shoulder, something Godric couldn't see. "Oh, there's my father. Hello, father. I'm coming." And he was gone. Godric reached the forest alone. He found a hollow beneath a fallen oak and crawled into it like a wounded animal. Around him, he could hear other survivors moving through the darkness, some calling for comrades, some weeping,
all lost. England had fallen. King Harold was dead, his brothers dead, his greatest warriors dead. Duke William the Bastard had won. And tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that, William would march to London and take the crown that Harold had worn for 9 months. Godric pressed his forehead against the cold earth and wept. He wept for Harold, who'd been a good king and hadn't deserved to die like that. He wept for Wulfric, who'd been kind to a scared boy and had died saving that boy's life. He wept for the 500 men who'd chased the feigned retreat and never came back. He wept for England itself, for the old world that had ended today on a blood-soaked hillside in Sussex. But even as he wept, even as the grief threatened to swallow him whole, he remembered his promise. Someone needs to tell the story true. 3 weeks later, Godric stood in his village for the first time since being conscripted. The place looked exactly the same thatched cottages, the same muddy paths, the same mill wheel turning in the stream. But everything was different. Everyone knew. News of the battle had spread like wildfire. King Harold dead, the English army destroyed, the Normans coming. Godric's father embraced him at the door of their cottage, held him so tightly that Godric thought his ribs might crack. His mother wept. His younger brother stared at him with wide eyes, taking in the new scars, the way Godric flinched at sudden movements, the darkness that hadn't been there before. "You survived," his father kept saying. "Thank God you survived." But Godric didn't feel like a survivor. He felt like a ghost. That night, the village elders gathered in the hall. They wanted to hear about the battle firsthand. Godric didn't want to tell them, didn't want to relive it, but he remembered his promise to Wulfric. So, he told them everything. He told them about the shield wall, about the Norman cavalry, about the feigned retreats, how they'd looked so real, how men died chasing an enemy that was only pretending to run. He told them about the bravery of the Huscarls, about Harold's brothers dying to protect their king, about Harold himself, fighting half-blind, refusing to surrender, refusing to run. And he told them about the end, about the moment the king fell, about how the heart went out of the English army all at once. When he finished, the hall was silent. Finally, the village priest spoke. "So we're to have a foreign king now? A Norman king?" "Yes," Godric said quietly. "And what kind of king will he be?" Godric thought about Duke William, the man whose tactical brilliance had defeated England's best warriors, the man who'd used deception as a weapon, who turned English pride against itself. "A hard king," Godric said finally. "But maybe a wise one too. He beat us by being smarter, not just stronger. A king who can think like that." He trailed off. It felt like treason to speak well of the man who'd killed Harold, but it was true. William had won because he understood war in a way Harold hadn't, had understood that sometimes retreat is advance, that sometimes losing is winning. "Will you fight him if he comes here?" his father asked. Godric looked at his hands. They still shook sometimes, especially at night. "No," he said. "The fighting's done. We lost. And I swallowed hard. I've seen enough death." 5 years later, England was a different country. William had been crowned king on Christmas Day 1066 in Westminster Abbey. The English nobles who'd submitted to him kept their lands, for a while. Those who'd resisted had been crushed. Norman barons now held most of the great estates. Norman clergymen ran most of the churches. The English language was becoming secondary to French in the halls of power. But England endured. Changed, yes. Conquered, yes, but not destroyed. Godric had married by then. He had a daughter, named her Eadgifu after his mother. He farmed his father's land and tried not to think about the battle too much. But sometimes, on October 14th, he would walk to the hill above his village and stand looking south, remembering. He kept his promise to Wulfric. Whenever anyone asked about Hastings, Godric told the story true. Not a glorious tale of heroes and honor, but the real story of tired men standing on a hill, of a clever enemy who used deception as a weapon, of pride and anger leading good men to their deaths. "Why do you always emphasize the false retreat? Why is that the part you focus on?" his wife asked him once. "Because it's the part people need to remember," Godric said. "The bravery, the courage, the fighting, people remember that naturally. But the lesson, the tactical lesson," he shook his head, "that takes work. Someone has to teach each new generation. Sometimes your enemy will show you what you want to see. They'll pretend to be weak when they're strong, pretend to run when they're setting a trap. And if you're not careful, if you let pride or anger or bloodlust make you stupid, they'll use your own strength against you." It was a lesson England had learned the hard way, but Godric was determined it wouldn't be forgotten. 20 years after Hastings, Godric was no longer young. His hair was graying, his back perpetually sore from farming. His daughter had married a Norman knight's son, a fact that would have seemed impossible in 1066, but was increasingly common now. England and Normandy were mixing, creating something new. One autumn day, a group of Norman soldiers came through the village. They were escorting a bishop, a Norman nobleman who'd fought at Hastings. The bishop stopped to water his horses and noticed Godric watching from his doorway. "You have the look of a soldier," the French-accented English said. "Once, long ago," Godric replied. "Where did you serve?" Godric hesitated, then said, "Senlac Hill, with King Harold." The bishop's eyebrows raised. "You were there? At the great battle?" "I was." The Norman bishop was quiet for a moment, studying Godric with new interest. Then, "May I ask you something? I've heard stories about that day, from both sides, but there's one thing I've never understood. Why did so many English leave their shield wall? Our own chronicles say your position was nearly impenetrable, yet hundreds of your men charged downhill after our cavalry. Why?" This was it, the question Godric had spent 20 years thinking about, the lesson he'd promised to preserve. "Because we saw what we wanted to see," Godric said. "Your cavalry looked defeated. They looked like they were running in fear, and we wanted to believe it. After fighting all morning,
After losing men, after standing in that wall, when we finally saw the enemy break, we wanted to chase them. We needed to. It was human nature." "But it was a trap," the bishop said. "Yes, a brilliant one. William knew we were tired, knew we were mostly farmers and craftsmen, not professional soldiers. He knew that if he showed us a fleeing enemy, some of us wouldn't be able to resist." Godric met the bishop's eyes. "It was the oldest trick in warfare, and it worked because pride is older still." The bishop nodded slowly. "Duke William, King William, I should say, he speaks of you English with respect, you know. He says you fought as bravely as any men he'd ever faced. The shield wall was magnificent, he says. It nearly won the day." "Nearly," Godric echoed. "But nearly isn't enough in war, is it?" "No," the bishop agreed. "No, it isn't." Godric lived to see William the Conqueror die, and his son, William Rufus, take the throne. He lived to see England become something neither purely English nor purely Norman, but a hybrid, changed by conquest but not erased by it. On his deathbed, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, some with English names, some with Norman, Godric thought about that October day 47 years earlier. Thought about Wulfric, who'd taught him how to stand in a shield wall and how to die with dignity. Thought about King Harold, who'd led from the front and fallen with his warriors. Thought about all the men who'd died on that hillside. "Tell them," he whispered to his eldest grandson, a young man named William, named for the conqueror because that was the world now, a world where English families named their sons after Norman kings. "Tell them what, grandfather?" "About the battle, about the false retreat, about the cost of pride." Godric's breathing was shallow now. Someone has to remember. Someone has to tell the story true." "I will," his grandson promised. "I'll tell them exactly as you told me." Godric smiled. "Good. That's good." He closed his eyes,
And in his mind, he was 17 again, standing in a shield wall on a hillside in Sussex, gripping a spear with shaking hands, watching an army advance through the mist. Ut, he whispered with his last breath. Ut.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.